ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
When Andrew Dwyer was growing up in Melbourne in the 1960s, the city wasn't the fabled food destination it is today. But courtesy of his Czechoslovakian godfather and then his stepmother from Hong Kong, Andrew's food world evolved from lamb chops to brioche and steamed fish eyes. Andrew fell in love with the wilderness at the same time he was falling in love with food, first exploring the Victorian Alps and then going further afield to Austria, where he spent years as a ski instructor. Eventually, Andrew combined his love for wild food and wild places, setting up a touring company with his wife Jane, taking people into the Australian Outback, where they didn't have to survive on the normal camping fare of dehydrated stew and 2-minute noodles. Instead, Andrew worked out how to cook dishes that you'd usually find in top restaurants in the city in the middle of the bush. Along the way, he won global tourism awards, released cookbooks, had a stint in the early days of TV cooking, all the while being pulled further and further west into more remote corners of Australia, completely in thrall to the wilderness. Hi, Andrew.
Hi.
So today, Melbourne is this big foodie destination, but what were things like food-wise when you were growing up there?
My parents used to go to a place on the Brighton Esplanade called Mario's, and I remember my father once telling me that he only ever drank beer, and he looked across the table when he was dating my mother and he saw someone with a bottle of red wine, and he said, "I'll have what they're having," and it was all
What is
downhill
this mysterious concoction?
Exactly right. No, Melbourne was pretty grim. I remember the most exotic thing in my childhood was on Thursday nights we used to go down to Richmond, and there was a little place called the Rigoletto, which was a single shop front, and it served pasta and ossobuco and Italian food to opera music, and that was a real eye-opener for me.
So what about at home? What did your parents cook for you at home?
Look, I was thinking about that the other day. There was a change. My earliest memories were of sort of lamb chops, mash and peas, and then things started getting exotic in the mid-'60s, and Mum would turn up with a steak. And so she had a vertical grill, and she'd put the steak in the vertical grill and then serve it with a French salad, which was lettuce, tomato with a vinaigrette, and that was sort of really exotic. And eating patterns had changed so much. I remember lamb was something that you just ate every day. It was a cheap cut, whereas nowadays it's quite the opposite.
Your mum and dad were keen sailors. What memories do you have of going out on the boats with them?
Look, one memory I have is going out without any bait into Port Phillip Bay, and I remember my father catching the first flathead on a cigarette butt, and then chopping it up for bait. But
I'm intrigued by that flathead's palate if it was filled by that cigarette butt.
Oh, back in the 60s, Port Phillip Bay was just crawling with flathead, and they're all hungry.
And so was that fish then that you cooked at home? Would your mum and dad cook fish that he caught?
Yes, Dad had filleted it on the beach and then take it home and dredge it in flour and fry it. And that was the culinary extent of seafood. Although we used to go to the Dramana foreshore on a Friday night and go to the fish and chip shop. And my sister and I would get a piece of flake and some chips, and our parents would get a crayfish wrapped up in newspaper.
That sounds good. In terms of seafood, were prawn cocktails a part of your mother's repertoire?
Oh, that was my mum's real specialty. That was for Christmases and exotic dinner parties, and it was the cocktail glass with the piece of iceberg lettuce, the Russian dressing with a couple of prawns. Yeah, it was pretty exciting.
Your parents' marriage ended, Andrew, and your dad found love again. How did cuisine change at home once your dad remarried?
Well, Sue May came into the family. She was from Hong Kong, and she brought with her all kinds of stuff that I'd never dreamt of. Things like chicken feet and jellyfish and Chinese bolognese, which is still a favourite of mine to this day, where you just take a wok and fry up tomatoes, garlic and mincemeat and add a little bit of soy and sugar, and it transforms this dish into something absolutely delicious.
What about Chinese spices and sauces? Was that a whole new part of the kitchen?
It sure was. I remember, like, my only experience before Sumé had come to Australia was, your ubiquitous Chinese restaurant and cafe, and sweet and sour pork and beef with black bean. That was about it. And when she arrived, all of a sudden there were 5 spices and cinnamons and star anise and all these different chili sauces. I mean, all of a sudden chili arrived, and now I just love chili and have since I was a teenager.
So you were getting to eat this new sort of food as a teenager. Were you also wanting to learn how to cook it?
Absolutely. In fact, I remember as a teenager I used to love inviting friends around from school and cooking them something in a wok. It was pretty exotic. I was very proud of myself.
And did she show you a different side of eating out in Melbourne? Like, were there restaurants beyond those Italian restaurants that you'd been to with your mum and dad?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, we became regulars at a place at the time that was known as the Flower Drum, and back in the day it was a small restaurant in Little Bourke Street, and it served very exotic stuff, and I loved it so much we ended up, Jane and I had our wedding reception there.
Is this where steamed fish eyes became part of your preferred delicacies, Andrew?
Yeah, look, that was sort of teenage bravado when I first tried them, but after a while I got to really like them. I used to shock girls that I'd go on a date with. We'd go to a Chinese restaurant and I'd be eating the eyes, and I could see the colour draining out of their faces.
I'm sure they'd be lining up to kiss you after that, Andrew. No. Those Anglo girls. I don't know. What's a fish eye taste like?
Yeah, look, it's fishy, but obviously, but the delightful thing is it's got an al dente. It's on the tooth when you bite into it. It's resistant, so it's kind of a textural thing. But right next to the eye is the cheek, and fish cheek would have to be the sweetest piece of the fish meat, and like steamed snapper in a bamboo steamer with just a little bit of garlic and spring onion and a splash of soy and sesame oil, and then just picking the cheeks out. I always go for the cheeks first.
Another important figure in your expanding food world was Uncle Ollie. Well, was he your real uncle?
No, he was my godfather, and he was a great friend of my parents. He had an extraordinary life and was an incredible mentor. He came to Australia as a refugee after World War II. He was in the Czech resistance. He had a degree in economics that wasn't recognised in Australia at the time, and he worked on the railways and ended up getting a job at Mount Buffalo as a ski instructor at the old Mount Buffalo Chalet, which to this day remains the largest Edwardian timber building in the Southern Hemisphere, even though it's not populated at the moment. It's closed up. And anyway, he sort of started a resort up there called Tattrine in the early 1960s. And I remember writing him a letter when I was about 8 or 9, I think, and asking for a job. And I got a reply. He said yes. So I jumped on the train and headed up to Mount Buffalo, and my eyes were open to an entirely new cuisine.
Why did you want a job at 8 or 9? What did you need money for?
Look, it wasn't so much money. In fact, I can't quite remember whether I was remunerated or not. I mean, these days, employing an 8 or 9-year-old, I think, is an offence. But I think I just went there because it was in a national park. I loved skiing, I loved the mountains, and it was an excuse to get up there.
And so, what were your obligations work-wise once you arrived at Mount Buffalo?
Oh, look, Ollie and his wife Betsy were terribly generous. They made me feel like I was working very hard. I used to man the kiosk, and I remember probably eating more cherry ripes than I
sold. Your payment.
Yeah, exactly. And used to go out skiing, and occasionally would relieve on the ski lifts, and in summer I remember walking up the mountains with Ollie and helping him clear shrubs scrub from the ski slopes, and I used to go on guided walks and help the mountain guide, and yeah, all kinds of sort of odd jobs.
And what sort of food did he introduce you to up there?
Look, I remember it was Eastern European food, and the kitchen has a smell that I'd forgotten. I was in Berlin a few years ago on a trade show, and I walked past a Czech restaurant, and that smell came back, and all those memories returned. And it was largely Eastern European food. There were dumplings, and there was sauerbraten and roast pig and cabbage and potatoes. But it was the way they were cooked. They were cooked in that sort of German, Czech, Eastern European style. And there were things like zuppa pavese.
What's that?
Well, it's a soup, a very clear broth soup with a raw egg tossed in the top, which back in Australia in the 60s and early 70s, it was not something you expected. And so that really excited me, that food had so many variances. Like today, people would be listening and thinking, oh, well, that's just food. But back in Australia in those days, it wasn't. It was something very exotic and very different.
So when you finished school, Andrew, clearly having this love of food and different kinds of flavours and ways of cooking food, what was your idea for what you'd do work-wise?
Well, I thought at the time, I'd always thought, because I loved Mount Buffalo so much in my time there, that I'd become a hotel manager. And so I enrolled in William Angliss for a diploma of hotel and catering operations, it was at the time.
And what sort of things were you taught in that?
Well, that was in the days before they had a licence. Nowadays, they have a very flash restaurant there that you can go and eat at. But in those days, without a licence, we used to put a cummerbund and an Eton jacket on, and then would stand in the bar mixing pineapple shakes and eggnogs and stuff like that.
A G-rated cocktail bar.
Yeah, exactly right. And look, it was quite confronting for me, because I'd been coerced into working for a friend of my parents who ran restaurants and nightclubs in Melbourne, and he was like the doyen of the Melbourne night scene, a guy called the late Brian Goldsmith. And so I was working for him at night at a place called the Bombay Bicycle Club, where there was live music. I remember Blondie playing there, and he gave me a job to run an 80-seat restaurant, and I thought, God, I've got no idea how to do this. And so I rang Uncle Ollie, and I remember him coming down and showing me how to make chicken Madeira and how to sort of roast a porterhouse steak and keep it in a bain marie so you could serve it later. And he taught me how to produce potatoes and salads and all this kind of stuff. And so I put this food out at the Bombay Bicycle Club, and it went off like a house on fire. People loved it.
And you were getting much more hands-on experience, it sounds, doing that than you were in your course with your pineapple shakes.
Exactly. And look, I was 18 years old, and here was this exotic world of music and nightlife and food, and yeah, it was very intoxicating.
So you'd started working in restaurants. How did you get your start as a ski instructor?
Well, what happened was I went to Adelaide. I was sent to Adelaide to run the Bombay Bicycle Club in Adelaide, and then I got into a partnership with another guy, and we opened a restaurant, blah, blah. It's a long story, but I ended up having the ability to spend winters back in Victoria, so I went to the mountains and skied. And then from there, I applied for jobs in Europe, and I got a job as a disc jockey in a place called Hopfgarten in Tyrol in Austria.
Had you had much experience as a disc jockey?
A little bit at the Bombay Bicycle Club. I think a few nights when the DJ didn't turn up, I'd get the job.
And what kind of tunes were you spinning?
The Tramps, Disco Inferno, Thelma Houston, Don't Leave Me This Way.
It sounds like a fantastic night, I have to say. So you got this job on the ski slopes, but as a DJ, not a ski instructor. Tell me about arriving there. How did it compare to what you were used to in terms of slopes in Australia?
Well, all of a sudden, there are these mountains that seem to go forever. And, yeah, I was working as a DJ in this tiny little European disco, and soon realised that the thing that turned people on there wasn't so much the music, but it was the beat of the music. They all loved to foxtrot. So you go to a disco and everyone would be dancing the foxtrot. And so all of a sudden I realised why John Paul Young was so successful in Europe, because of he had the same beat for every song, that dum da dum 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 da dum dum. It's foxtrot.
That's not what I
Lovers in
expect. How I expected people to be dancing to the Tramps.
Lovers in the air. And very shortly after moving there, there was a friend of mine from Mount Buller who said, "Why don't you work as a ski instructor?" So I fronted up at the ski school and did an exam, and they took me on. And so I was taking people skiing all over these resorts. What
was the life of a ski instructor like in the 1970s, Andrew?
Pretty wild, especially for It was physically challenging. I guess, to be honest, I'll be frank with you, I taught skiing all day and partied all night.
I hope so. I think if you have that job, you're obligated. Did you have a moustache?
I did.
What of magnitude?
It was one of those Germanic moustaches, and I attempted to grow. I didn't have that much facial hair at the time, and I attempted to grow one of those lovely big handlebar things, but it never quite eventuated. What happened was while doing that DJing and ski instructing and living that life, I kept looking out beyond to all the mountains in the distance, and that's what compelled me to stay in Austria and to start mountaineering. And so I was doing lots of ice climbing and steep skiing and just becoming an alpinist, I guess, because of that love of wilderness.
How different is it skiing down a slope when you've climbed up there yourself rather than catching a ski lift up?
That's a spiritual experience. It's a strange... When you first start climbing and touring, the walk up is the hard bit. It's the hard work for the joy of skiing down. But after a while, when you get into a motion of walking up and up and up for, say, 5-6 hours on a virgin mountain, it becomes a meditation, and it becomes, I guess, quite a spiritual experience. And then when you arrive at the top and you take the skins off the skis, and then you have this descent, which might take an hour or even longer on completely virgin, unskied terrain, it's terribly exciting and terribly fulfilling.
After that time in the Alps, you spent some time in London where you met Jane, your wife, and ended up back in Melbourne together. How did you go about supporting your little family there?
Oh, that was pretty tough at the time, because I'd arrived back in Australia and I bought a little recording studio and started recording demos, and the record companies loved my work but didn't buy. And so, I was in a situation where Jane was doing some night shifts as a nurse because she was a registered nurse. And we had one child, my first son, Paddy, and we were living in a rented place in Elwood. And I got a job in a production house recording 30-second radio commercials with the carrot on the end of the stick that eventually I would be composing music for film. But the reality was it was just 30-second radio jingles, and I got terrible cabin fever.
Are those jingles still buried in your brain to this day?
Look, I've tried to exorcise the demon, but a couple of them are. There's one a BP Clean and Go ad that I did on a synthesizer, which sounded like drops of rain. It's horrible.
So what role did food have in your life and your work at this point?
Well, food had sort of taken a backward step in a way, because I was just working in this studio. The only thing I was doing at home was cooking for my wife and a newborn boy. And I just chanced upon neighbours who were living next door. One of them was the doyen of natural food. I don't know what natural food means, but this guy, John Downs, who founded the Natural Tucker Bakery and wrote several cookbooks. And he was really interested with modern food, and he sort of opened me up to all that sort of whole food and macrobiotic food. And so food started taking off again. And to cut a long story short, we opened a cafe for a few months. It didn't work. I had cabin fever from being in Melbourne, and my wife and I sat down, did a SWOT analysis, and said, well, what are you good at? Well, I can cook, I could lead people, I could teach skiing, I could speak German and English. And so with that SWOT analysis, we decided, for all the wrong reasons, to start a tourism business.
And what was the idea? Where were you going to lead people in your...
Well, I started off going to the country that I knew, the Victorian High Country. But, my knowledge was Mount Bogong, Mount Hotham, Mount Buller, and there was this magnificent walking track, which still exists today, which goes from Baw Baw up to Canberra, and a section of it from the Bluff near Mount Buller to some really spectacular walking over places that some listeners will be familiar with, like the Crosscut Saw and the Viking and the Razor and Mount Bogong. And so I decided I was going to run walks. And to do that, we needed to get some clients. So I Roneoed off on the old Roneo machine a sort of a brochure and then stuck it up in cafe windows all around North Fitzroy and Carlton. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to do this, I'm going to need to know where I'm going. So I got my mum to drive the vehicle, and she'd drop me off on fire trails, and then I'd walk. And, some nights I'd get in on schedule. I remember I'd scheduled a day to go over the Razor Viking, and I ended up walking into camp at about 2 a.m, which was a bit of grief. But eventually we worked out the route, and so the idea was that we'd pick people up in Melbourne, we'd take them up to the Bluff, we'd carry all their gear, and then they'd walk across this alpine wilderness, usually reserved for people with 30-kilo packs, and we'd carry all the gear and meet them at intersections along the way with a vehicle which would have a hot shower and a sit-down dinner, and the tents would be set up. And so
this all sounds perfect, Andrew. I can't imagine what could possibly go wrong with such a plan, with you and your mum involved in your little ads around the cafes of Melbourne. I guess, first of all, did people respond? Did you find guests for that first trip?
Look, I did. It was extraordinary. I found 4 guests. From memory, I think it was $950 for 14 days, all inclusive. And so anyway, I thought, oh, gee, this is serious. So I need to start thinking about infrastructure, because I didn't have any. And I didn't have the funds to go out and purchase gear, and didn't have any understanding of the regulatory environment in those days. We didn't have any permits. There wasn't any public liability insurance. I borrowed a mate's trailer. I hired a 4-wheel drive. I went down to a bush outfitters in Little Bourke Street, which was the outdoors precinct, and I hired tents. And then I went to the tip and got an old fridge, tipped it on its back and filled it full of dry ice, went down to the Victoria markets, bought the most delicious food I could possibly imagine, packed everything out of our kitchen into boxes, and headed off to the Hyatt Hotel to meet the guests.
How did that go? Did that preparation stand you in good stead once the journey actually began?
Look, it's a long time ago now. I think it was 1988. But what I do remember, there are two take-homes from it. First, I remember the dry ice melted overnight and all the food went rotten, and I had to send my mum off on a mercy mission to Coles in Benalla to pick up more food. And the second thing I remember is that one of the guests kept saying to me, "How far is it to camp?" And I say, "Oh, not too far." And he'd say, in another half an hour, "How far is it to camp?" "Oh, just over the next hill." And then I remember after a few days he started to ask me, "Have you been here before?" I said, "Of course I have, of course I have." Anyway, at the end of the trip, they all loved it. Some of them have been travelling with me. One person came on my very last trip earlier this year before I retired. So it was lovely to build those relationships with people. But yeah, the first trip was pretty wild. I don't think you could start a business like that nowadays, because the regulatory environment and is such, and the red tape, that you just can't go and do that stuff. And in one respect, I understand it, but in the other, I think it's kind of sad that in society now there's no room for mavericks.
You had an early trip out to climb the highest mountain in South Australia too. Tell me about that.
Yeah, that was a real eye-opener for me, and the beginning of a journey in life. I wanted to climb Mount Woodruff, which is the highest mountain in South Australia. It's 4,000 feet in old terms. And it's in the middle of the APY lands, the Arnungu Pitjantjatjara lands. And that country was pretty well off limits. And back in the day, there wasn't Google or computers. And I started phoning around, and I ended up getting in touch with a Uniting Church minister in Geelong, of all places, who said, "I know a man who can help you." And his name was Peter Nunningu. And Peter was a senior lawman, the most extraordinary fellow. And I organised a trip. It was I think a 7-day trip out of Adelaide. We drove up the Stuart Highway and entered the Musgrave Ranges, which are like Switzerland in the outback, these stunning peaks. And it's all on Aboriginal land. And in those days, there were no sealed roads at all. And we drove out to Nunanjara, which was his homeland. And we spent 5 days just sitting around the river and walking around and looking at bush foods. And he said on the second day we were there, he said, let's go hunting. And I thought, wow, hunting, that sounds exciting. So we got the Land Rovers and things, and everyone jumped in the back of the utes, the women, the men. They had these steel spears, and I thought, gee, this is going to be exciting. And we drove down to this big rabbit mound. Because back in those days, before calicivirus, rabbits were everywhere. And then we all jump out, and the women sort of immediately run over to the mound and start digging with their hands and the sticks, while the men all stand around the Land Rover chatting and talking. Anyway, these women dug for half an hour, 45 minutes, really hard work. Then finally there was lots of excitement, and one of the women reached down into the hole and pulled out a rabbit, gave it to the Aboriginal man that was standing there, and he sort of wrung its neck. That was his job. So,
it's like rabbit takeaway, the way he's describing that.
Yeah, that was the hunting, and then that night we sat around the fire in the riverbed and ate rabbit. But after 5 days and having all this cultural exchange, I remember completely unannounced, Peter just said to me the next morning, he said, you want to climb up that mountain? And I hadn't even had the discussion because I was aware of the sensitivities of it. And so, we'd just been there to spend time. And so the following morning we ascended to the summit of Mount Woodruff, and I went home thinking I would really like to get involved in tourism that involved Indigenous culture and Aboriginal people.
Podcast and broadcast. This is Conversations with Sarah Konofsky.
So, Andrew, it sounds like as well as the connections you were making with people in the desert, the outback itself was also getting its claws into you.
Yeah, exactly. I think from all the reading I've done on the early explorers, it was the same deal. I mean, those guys and women in the 19th century that would go out and pioneer and, have homesteads. The men would go out boundary riding. The women would raise families in impossible situations. The explorers that marched across Gibber Plains, almost perishing. When they came back to civilization, all they wanted to do was get back out there again. And the country calls to you. And I've met over my career so many people who have gone out there and never come back and live in very remote areas and become completely intoxicated with the remote outback. But the curious thing is, in Australia, we've always historically looked to the sea for news from home, and we all live around the coast. And the inland was, in the 19th century, was considered the ghastly blank. It was inhospitable and hostile and valueless, and you couldn't have, green fields with farms, and so we shunned the outback. But the weird thing is that when you go to the outback, it's very difficult to come back.
You led a series of expeditions in the footsteps of some of those 19th century explorers, including one in 1998 into the Simpson Desert. What were you after on that trip?
Yeah, that was a curious expedition. It was David Lindsay, an explorer who in the 1880s was sent by the then Minister of Education out into the Simpson Desert to look for water. And so he left with one Aboriginal assistant and a handful of camels in January when the heat was just beyond belief. And he disappeared off into the sandhills. And 3 months later, he resurfaced. And in that time, he'd lived out in the Simpson Desert and come across 9 wells, which were native wells, which the Wangaru people called Mikari. And they've long silted up, but they had a 300-verse song cycle that the Wangaru would sing their way across the desert and navigate their way through this seemingly nondescript dune field. And each of the wells had a dreaming or a lore attached to it, and there were different songs and different legends, and so each well had its own personality. And we decided to go out there and see if we could relocate those wells.
And how were you going to do that? Had you left records or maps, or did you have Aboriginal guides? How were you going to find them?
No, well, there's a guy, Rick Amos, who was really passionate about this, and so he came with us, and I had two other people, so there were only four of us. And Rick found David Lindsay's journals in an office in Adelaide, the original journals, just sitting there gathering dust on a windowsill. It's extraordinary as it seems. And he gave distances and bearings. And back in those days, we were using maps, but dead reckoning, you could get a rough idea of where these wells were. And so we'd take off and drive on the old oil seismic lines and tracks into the desert. And then when we got close to where we thought one of these wells was, we'd strike off cross country. And sometimes they took a day or so to find. The first one took us about a full day, even though we were within a couple of kilometres of it. But once we found the first one, we sort of got our eye in and knew what we were looking for. They were in depressions. There was certain vegetation that was common to all of them. So gradually we recovered them all. And I remember one of them, Walporican it was called. There was a steel drawer, and it had hoop iron handles on each end, and it was rusted and flattened. The only people I know that have been there since David Lindsay was an explorer called Dennis Bartels and a linguist from ANU, Louise Hercus. And otherwise, back in those days, we were the only people who have ever gone there. And so I can only surmise that drawer belonged to David Lindsay.
Did you leave it there?
Absolutely, yeah.
And is there still water in those wells, Andrew?
There is if you dig for it, but you've got to dig down 4 or 5 metres, which we didn't do. But Dennis Bartels had an auger with him when he went and he dug down. But no, they've all completely filled in. They're silted in, so all you have is a sort of a crater-like depression in the ground. But they used to be these ramps that would go down, and David Lindsay was a skinny guy, but he was saying you had to hold your breath and he had to take his waistcoat off and sidle down sideways into these wells to collect the water.
On another expedition, you were looking for the remains of Alfred Gibson, who I guess the desert is named for. Is that the same Gibson?
That is, yeah, that's one of Australia's great mysteries. It was right through the 90s and into the early 2000s, I was passionate about Gibson. In fact, in the mid-90s, there was an article in Good Weekend where I proposed that perhaps Gibson was victim of foul play. The basic premise is 2 men ride out and 1 comes back. And Ernest Giles was this incredibly flowery guy who spoke in poetic language and had all kinds of unpleasant encounters with the local Indigenous people, but is much loved by Australians because of his flowery language. But I suspect he wasn't quite as lovable as once you start reading between the lines and researching it.
So he came back and Alfred Gibson disappeared.
That's right.
And what were you looking for then on that expedition?
Well, Australian deserts are aeolian deserts. That is, they're wind-blown. And so therefore heavy objects sit on the surface. They don't get buried. So therefore we were looking for surcingles, bridles, remains of old saddlery. Gibson rode off with Giles' Gregory patent compass, which was a prized possession of Giles, and that was a brass thing that used to sit on the pommel of a saddle to navigate, and there would have been a weapon. So that stuff could well be laying on the ground. But again, it's incredibly difficult. So in exactly the same way we were looking for the native wells, the idea was we have Giles' journals, and you have to take them on face value. So he says he went to the end of the Rawlinson Range and then headed due west. And so we did that and headed due west for 90 miles out to a place exactly as Giles described in his journals. We didn't find Gibson. So then we tried to think about other angles as to, well, perhaps it didn't occur as Giles said. Perhaps this happened. And so we went down to some obscure ranges that no Europeans had ever visited, and we wandered around there and we found some interesting stuff down there, but we didn't find any remains of Gibson. So he's still out there somewhere. As
you say, Andrew, of course, this is new territory for Europeans, but First Nations people have known it for tens of thousands of years. What kind of evidence or indications of Aboriginal use and culture did you find?
Back in the early days, I think one of the most exciting things I found was there was a small hill, and it had these little bird feet chipped into the rock. and then a circle, and I didn't really know what that meant at the time. And we climbed over the rocks and we found a tree in a dry creek bed, and the tree was full of zebra finches, these beautiful little birds, which tend to denote that there's water somewhere close by. And sure enough, in this dry creek bed near the tree all the birds were, there was a little soak. And about a month later, I was back on APY lands and I spoke to Peter about it, and I told him I saw this circle and these little bird prints and explained the size of them. And he said, and so what did you think they mean? And I said, well, I thought, well, where the little birds are, there are water. And he said, exactly right. That was a marker. And so all these sort of experiences make you start to feel very close to the land. And as the business progressed, I started doing more work with Aboriginal people and going further west. And for the last several years, I've been working with the Pintabee Nine, or the members of the Pintabee Nine who live in the most remote part of Outback Australia, and they were a family who came into the modern world in 1984. 1984, they had not experienced European or modern Australian civilization at all. And in 1984, there was a meeting by a water pump with some Aboriginal people who had come in previously, and they convinced them to come to the community of Kiwakara. And those people have had a really interesting life since then. And there are 2 daughters and a man still living in Kiwakara, Wallumpiri, Yakulchi and Yalti. And through the great work of the Chamu Chamu Aboriginal Corporation and the Indigenous Desert Alliance, we managed to work through the sort of sensitivities, and we're able to run tours out to Lake Mackay, this vast salt lake, and camp with these Pintabee Nine people, which is possibly the absolute highlight of my career.
Well, as a food person, Andrew, what kind of food, what eating was part of their culture that you got to learn about?
Yeah, look, it was very much based on survival. I remember the first experience I had with that cuisine was at a place called Victory Well in the Everard Ranges, where we'd been invited to an inma, which is what some people would call a corroboree. And the sun was setting, and one of my guests had been out on a sandhill, and they'd found all these what looked like truffles, white truffles, and they'd come in and it was damp, it had been raining, and I showed them to Peter, and I said, "Are these native truffles?" And he says, "Yeah, good tucker, that one." And so I thought, well, what am I going to do with them? And so I tried to get all the sand and grit out of them, and I decided I'd try making a truffle fettuccine. And so garlic and butter and fettuccine, and I stir-fried this all up because you use a wok to make fettuccine after you've boiled it in the bush, because you don't have the luxury of a commercial kitchen. And so I cooked all this stuff up, and then I had a whole pile of these truffles left in a silver bowl. And everyone turned up to eat, and I was serving all our hosts as well. And all the older people were just eating the leftover truffle with all the sand straight out of the bowl. But what was interesting about the truffles was they were virtually flavourless. There was no real identifiable flavour with these truffles at all, but they sound terribly exotic. There are some bush foods that I use and really love. I mean, quandongs are sublime.
What's the That's the purpley blue kind of fruit, is that right? What's a quandong look like?
It's a red fruit, and it grows in arid and semi-arid areas. It's of the sandalwood family, and it has a huge nut with a tart fruit surrounding it, and the nut the early settlers used to use as Chinese checker pieces, and you can smash the kernel, and it has flesh inside it, which is redolent of almond, but the outer shell, or the outer fruit, is just extraordinary. It's tart but sweet, and a really complex flavour, and goes really well with game. So I keep it in the freezer at home. If ever I come across a quandong tree, I just harvest and then put it in the freezer and cook it with venison and stuff. Yeah, so a lot of the food out there is very much subsistence. I remember going out with Yakulchi, and she'd spend 3 or 4 hours digging enough seed or wild onion to make into a patty to have enough food for sort of 3 or 4 people to eat. So intensely labour-intensive work, but extraordinary. The most extraordinary thing is here we are following Yakulchi as she walks around in bare feet through this sort of spinifex country, and it's like a supermarket to her. Effortlessly she's grabbing food out of the great sandy desert, whereas if we were out there we wouldn't survive 24 hours. It's like an IGA for her.
What about feral cats, Andrew, which, are this blight in Australia, but this amazing source of protein, a food source for lots of First Nations people?
Yeah, very much so. It's really interesting. The Anangu have pussycat dreaming, but they don't have camel dreaming. A lot of people have thought that perhaps cats have been here for a little longer than when Europeans arrived. We're pretty sure that they were at least here when the Macassans were fishing for trepang off the north coast, back in the 16th century, 17th century. So these cats, as extraordinary predators, they are great protein, and Aboriginal people have been hunting them. But then I thought, well, how do you hunt a cat? Because cats are really fast and cunning, and I couldn't hunt a cat, and so you watch these ladies go hunting cats, and so they walk along, and the secret is they're such good trackers. So they'll look at the ground and read the ground as if it was a book, and I say, I see that track there, and I'll say, yeah, and she'll say, that cat was a day ago, and see that track there, that one was there this morning. See that one, that was here an hour ago. And so then they start following that track, and then they'll get closer and the cat will spot them and run off, and they'll just keep following, and they might jog a little and walk a little, and they keep following. And eventually cats have a lot of speed but no stamina. And then the pussycat will finally get exhausted, lie down, then just club it over the head. And a number of Pintabee consider cat their most favourite meat.
And what's it taste like?
Chicken.
Cat can't be the answer for everything. I had bush rat in the Amazon, and it wasn't like chicken. It was just disgusting. What about a cat? Give me more descriptors.
It's sort of a grey meat. It's strong insofar as any meat's strong when it's cooked over the ashes in its fur. So it's got a bit of game to it, but it's not something that I'd prepare at home.
There wouldn't be much to it. I mean, how big are these cats that are roaming the desert?
They're big, although I've never seen one like the anecdotal ones that you hear about that are the size of panthers or cougars. I've never seen a feral. I've seen lots of feral cats, but they're just like a large tabby, really.
So it's a snack rather than a meal for a family, I'm guessing.
Yeah, a couple of people get it. There's about as much meat on a cat as there would be a chook.
You were interested in cooking European food, Western food as well, as using native ingredients when you were leading tours out to these remote parts of Australia. How did you go about doing that practically? I mean, you described your early experience with the old fridge that didn't do a good job of keeping your ingredients fresh. How did you keep food that you were bringing with you fresh, and then how did you actually go about cooking it? What were your techniques for when you were on these remote camping expeditions?
I learned along the way. It was trial and error. I've already mentioned the first disasters, but I cooked on an open fire, and so in order to do that I had to use bush techniques, and so I used camp ovens, and thanks to Sue May, I had a wok with a long wooden handle on it. So it means a wok is a fantastic thing in the bush because you can just light a little twig fire, and then you can stir fry up a meal in minutes with just a small twig fire. So I'd use a wok, I'd use camp ovens, and I had a grill plate which was concrete reinforcement wire, and then once I got to the outback it became quite different, because the outback, the wood is entirely different. Desert wood burns slow and dense, and so in the morning you can rake over what looks like just white ashes and there'll be lovely warm coals, so you can cook dampers and things. You can control your heat a lot easier in the desert. A shovel load of red coals on top of a camp oven lid's enough to cook a whole leg of lamb. So I got the heat right, and open fires are great for heat. You can have heat much hotter than you can in the hottest wok burner in a Chinese restaurant. But storage was the issue, and so in the old days all we had was ice, and then came the larger Engel fridges, and then I found these fabulous Stay Fresh bags, these green bags, which were developed through CSIRO. They're Australian technology, which uses membrane technology and keeps vegetables for 3 or 4 times their normal life. So I could pack snow peas into these Stay Fresh bags, put them in the fridge, and then serve them crisp 3 weeks later. The meat was all vacuum sealed, and so then it would be menu planning. So you'd serve the first night out. I'd always serve this beautiful barramundi in a panko gremolata crust that the barramundi had come down from Darwin. It was wild caught. Then the second night I'd serve chicken. And then after that, we'd start moving on to red meats because they last longer. And then with vegetables, you'd use fresh salads and when you start, and then gradually move over to root vegetables, and sometimes augmenting food with something that you get in a can, or Asian food, which is fantastic because so much of that is dried. You get these magnificent dried mushrooms and dried vegetables, which you can reconstitute and serve. So it was a passion of mine because I loved food. I felt that if you're in a wild place, your senses are heightened because you're active, you're doing stuff, you're out in a really fresh air, and so your sense of taste and smell isn't assaulted by all the smells in a city or when you walk into a restaurant. You're out there in the wilderness, and there's nothing better than sitting down at night at a table with the sounds of the night and the stars overhead and eating a fantastic meal. And I sometimes think, well, maybe the food isn't that good. It's just the fact that those senses are.
I don't know. The way you're describing it's making my tummy rumble. So I think it was probably pretty good. What are some of the locations, some of the spots that you've had those meals in that stand out in your memory as being special places to have been able to be?
In the high country, my very favourite place is the summit of the Viking. It's in a wilderness area. It's surrounded by cliffs, and it's got this little grass meadow with a couple of stunted snow gums, and you can look out on all sides to the wilderness, see no evidence of humanity. And as the wind howls over the top of these cliffs, you're in this little sheltered valley, and you used to cook stir-fried tempeh with snow peas. Out in the outback, there's so many places out there, which one of my favourite places to serve a meal is on Lake Mackay, where we'd set up tables and chairs out on the salt. And it is such a surreal thing. I remember once after dinner getting everyone to walk out onto the salt for about a kilometre, and there was no lights. It was a starry night, but there was no moon, and so the entire universe was this silver starry light reflecting off the salt. And I got everyone to stand in a circle with their backs to each other, and then I said, now everyone walk out 100 paces and then just stand there for 5 minutes, and then I'll call you back, because it was dark and it'd be easy to get lost. So it was easy to walk out and walk back. So everyone walked out, and you could see stars rising on the horizon where they'd rise orange through the atmosphere, the light, in the same effect as the sun or the moon. It was like going to outer space. The most astonishing experience.
You've done this workout or this travelling out into the outback for so many years, Andrew, that it's inevitable there are going to be some disasters along the way, more serious maybe than your veggies going off. Have there been times when you've been stuck in a pickle out there in the bush?
Look, yes, and I think that's part of the job. It goes with the terrain. And I've always said to my crew that when you strike problems, that's part of the deal, and nothing's insurmountable. You just have to fix it and move on. That's the outback. That's what it throws up. And so over the years we've worked out how to be self-sufficient. I mean, I remember towing a dead ute over the Simpson Desert many years ago, a Toyota Land Cruiser with a snatch strap on. We pulled it for probably 350 kilometres over sand dunes. We pulled a Mitsubishi Canter bus halfway down the Canning Stock route because it couldn't get over the sandhills. I remember being stuck in a dust storm once. This is back in the late 80s, I think, very early on in the piece. And this thing was extraordinary. The temperature went up to 50 degrees, and it was so hot we couldn't run the air conditioning, and it was like being in a thick fog, except it was mustard coloured, and everyone had spray bottles to try and keep cool. And then at night, the wind just got stronger and stronger. So we had tents in those days. So we buried all the tents in sand, like all around the sides, so they'd hold up in the wind. Everyone went to bed. And in the morning, a couple of the tents were literally buried. They were under sand. It howled and howled and howled. And then it was a quiet, still cool morning. And when you're taking guests with you who may be not inured or used to those kind of experiences, it's part and parcel of the outback. And I guess the lovely thing about travelling with Australians as opposed to international people is Australians kind of get it. They know that there might be flies, or it might be windy, it might be hot, it might be cold.
Your tent might get buried in sand. These things happen.
Exactly. It's look. With all wild places, there's a compromise, and I do worry that those experiences are becoming harder and harder to get. But the thing I notice most about people travelling with me now, as back when I started, is when you get up in the morning and you have a fresh coffee and you're standing around the campfire and you say to someone, how'd you sleep? And they'll say, oh, yeah, not bad, or no, not good, or fantastic, but it was a bit hot, or it was a bit cold. And how are you feeling now? Oh, I'm a bit cold. And I pondered on this for a long time. I mean, you get a lot of time to muse things out in the desert. And it's because so many people nowadays live in a temperature-controlled life. So they go from their air-conditioned house to their air-conditioned car to their air-conditioned workspace. Then they go to their air-conditioned shopping mall to shop and recreate. And so everything's temperature-controlled. So back in the 1980s, it wasn't so much. And people would go out to the desert and they'd be quite comfortable with changing temperatures. Whereas nowadays, people are a lot more temperature sensitive, and that's just an observation, and I just hope that people will continue to be allowed to go to wild places and to experience nature and recognise that it's a really important part of our soul.
You just did your last season out in the Northern Territory, Andrew. You are now officially retired. How's life going to change for you?
I'm not sure. I'm very blessed to live on a property surrounded by bushland in Jamison in northeast Victoria. So I'm still around nature and I still spend a lot of my time in the bush. I intend to go back to the outback regularly because I don't think you could spend the length of time I have out there and not go back. It calls. But see, I also love ocean sailing. I used to do a lot of ocean racing, and that's a wild place. I just love wild places. So I intend to pursue spending as much time as I can in nature.
It sounds like you have done a wonderful job of combining the things that make you happy, from food to wild places, and extending that to other people. It's been really wonderful to hear about your life. Thank you so much for being my guest on Conversations.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for listening to me.
This is Conversations with Sarah Kanowski. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
Andrew Dwyer was my guest on Conversations today, and this episode of Conversations was recorded on the lands of the Yagara, Turrbal and Wurundjeri peoples. It was produced by Maggie Morris, and our executive producer is Nicola Harrison. I'm Sarah Kanowski. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Sarah Kanowski. For more Conversations interviews, head to the website abc.net.au/conversations.